politics and society. Though actually I'm not a student of history, as a student of statistics, it was his work on feudalism debate in India that has attracted me to study this phase of history. And apart from that, he's also edited the book The Feudalism Debate, which is a path breaking in the literature of Indian history. Now, Professor Mukhia, sir, you can continue with this lecture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Arnab. And friends, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. And thank you very much for inviting me, inviting this very old man to lecture to you. It's always good to interact with students. One gets fresh ideas from students. And particularly, as Arnab said, the audience is a mixed bag. It's not merely students of history, but others as well, which is wonderful. Well, I'll speak to you for about an hour or so, and then we'll have some 15 odd minutes for discussion. I hope that's fine by you. Yeah. Now, history, colonization, decolonization, recolonization of Indian history. That's what we are going to talk about. But let me begin by saying that, there are two aspects that we have to consider. One is the notions of past or ideas about the past, and the other is ideas about history. They are interconnected, obviously, but they are not the same. You can have, as I shall try to show very briefly, you can have, a society can have ideas about the past, not necessarily having ideas of history. In fact, all of us has, individually, as a family, as a community, as a society, as a civilization, all of us have ideas of the past. Some idea of the past of the family. In my grandfather's time, it used to be like this. My grandfather didn't do it like this. He used to do like this. So that's the idea of the past of the individual. You see, as the child grows up. And the family has its own idea of the past. No, our family never did it like this. It's the others who did it like this, and so on and so forth. And so societies also have ideas of the past. Why am I saying that you can have ideas of the past, but not necessarily ideas of history? What is the distinction between history and the notions of the past? The distinction is that history is a separate discipline. It is independent of, like all other disciplines, economics or political science or physics or chemistry. Like all other discipline, it's a fully fledged, developed discipline which deals with the past, but past has many other things apart from history. Past has the notions of the past, have notions of culture, notions of heroism, notions of excuse me, virility, femininity, notions of beauty, and so on and so forth, notions of morality. So that the past is much more comprehensive than history is. History is an aspect of the past, but history is a fully fledged discipline like all other disciplines. So when we are dealing with Indian history, we'll be dealing with a discipline called Indian history or history in India. Let me go a little further and say that, in a way, when one hears historians talk about history is the oldest discipline. You often hear history is the oldest discipline. How do you know history is the oldest discipline? Immediately, Herodotus is mentioned. Herodotus is the first historian. So history, in a way, begins with Herodotus, 4th century BC in Greece. Is that how history began? What is the meaning of saying history is the oldest discipline and it begins with how old it is? You will get to know once you realize that it begins with Herodotus in the 4th century BC. Is that how history began? What does the meaning of history beginning with Herodotus? The meaning is that history, as soon as you say history begins with Herodotus, you confine it spatially to Europe. That is to say, it began in Europe, began in Greece, and therefore in Europe. So spatially, history has its origins, a spatial origin, namely Europe. And secondly, that it has a temporal origin. It began in a particular period of time, whether it's 4th century BC or whatever period, 5th century AD or whatever. But it began at in a particular space and a particular time period. Is that how history began? Is that how we understand history? History actually is a far more widespread phenomenon. The notion of not only of the past but even of history is far more widespread, spatially and temporally, than it is assumed. Than it is presumed when you say history began with Herodotus. History did not begin with Herodotus. History began at many other places and in many other temporal zones and spatial zones. So it's not purely a European phenomenon or European invention at a particular period of time. Now, in other words, every society, every civilization has its own traditions, first of the past, not necessarily of history, but certainly of the past, of which history is one part, the other parts, but history is one part. Every society, every civilization has its own traditions. And therefore, history is a universal. Every society, in a way, has contributed to the formation of history as a discipline. And therefore, history is a universal discipline rather than a European discipline, a discipline which has been given to us by Europe at a particular period of time. It's far much wider than that. It's a universal discipline. Let me run through very briefly some of the sort of traditions of history. We can't go through all of them or even several of them, couple of them, just to illustrate my point. Some of the traditions of history writing apart from Europe. Europe also, of course, yes, we'll come to that. China, for example, has its own very separate tradition. It has what does history deal with? History deals with time and space. I'm a historian of medieval India, I was introduced. Medieval is time, India is space. So-and-so is a historian of modern China. Modern is time, China is space. So-and-so is a historian of modern Europe. So time and space, these are the two constituents of history, time and space. And therefore, each region, each civilization, each society has its own notion of time and space. Today, we don't have that different notions of time and space. We'll come to that in a moment. But there was a time when each civilization had its own notion of time and space and its notion of past and history. Let's take up ancient India, for example, to begin with. Ancient India, early India, as it's more preferably called, uh, because as soon as you use the term ancient and then medieval and modern, you fall into the category which has been given to us by Europe. This tripartite division, ancient, medieval, modern, is a European invention of the 17th century. I'll come to that in a moment. So many historians, like Romila Thapar, they don't use the term ancient. They use the term early because ancient has that trap, falling into that tripartite division of ancient, medieval, and modern. So anyway, so early India uh, didn't have history as a didn't treat history as a separate discipline. It treated the notions of the past, notions of history as its notions of the past. Its notions of the past were not demarcated. This is history, this is mythology, this is Puranic stories, these are folk tales, etc., etc. There is also always there is a complete mix-up of various kinds of traditions, religious traditions, scriptural traditions, moral traditions, social traditions, social moralities, and so on and so forth. So that, and of course, political events like wars and battles and conquests and so on and so forth. So that in early India, uh, history is a mix. It's not a clear-cut discipline, separate discipline, as we begin to understand later on, or as it is in another tradition. I'll come to that. But history is an ensemble. It's a whole sort of. It's a one single whole of which there are many parts. They all constitute notions of the past and therefore notions of history. Islamic world, on the other hand, has a fairly distinct notion of history. Uh, in Islamic world, history comes as a part of Islam itself. Prior to the birth of Islam in Arabia, there were literate people. It's not as if they were illiterate, but there was no notion of history as such. Uh, it was, as one Tariq Khalidi, one historian, Syrian historian, puts it beautifully, Islam not only gave a new religion to humanity, but also a new concept of history. It gave a new concept of history because once Islam was born as a religion which was meant to be a world religion. It's not that today it has become world religion. It was meant to be a world religion. Why, as Christianity is also meant to be a world religion? How are they meant to be world religion? Because the assumption is that Christianity for Christians implies the ultimate truth. Jesus is the Son of God, and God therefore has spoken the truth, the ultimate truth to humanity through Jesus. And therefore, this ultimate truth which God has revealed to humanity through Jesus will conquer. If that is the ultimate truth, if that is the truth, then all else is falsehood. And there is a conflict between the truth and falsehood, all falsehoods. And in this conflict, the truth will vanquish all falsehoods in the end. And therefore, the belief of Christians is that on the day of judgment, one day before the day of judgment, when the world will come to an end, all of humanity would have become Christian. It is in that sense that it's a world, it is meant to be a world religion in the sense of the truth of Christianity as the Christians believe it, the truth of Christianity will conquer, will vanquish all other untruths which go in the name of as other beliefs or belief systems and religions and so on and so forth. It is the same is true of Islam. Uh, Muhammad is the last of all prophets. Muhammad is not only a prophet, but he is the. All of these are prophets. Jesus, Moses, and Abraham, and so on and so forth. They are all prophets. Hundreds of prophets. But Muhammad is the last prophet, ultimate prophet. After that, there will be no prophet. That's what Islam believes. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Muhammad is the Rasul, the Prophet of Allah, the last Prophet, the last Prophet of Allah. So the last truth has been revealed to humanity through Muhammad. Earlier it was revealed for Christians, it was revealed through Christ. Now it is for the Muslims, it is revealed through Muhammad. And therefore, Quran is the last word, the last truth revealed by God. It's God's own word, and which cannot be challenged. So therefore, ultimately, like Christianity will vanquish, the truth of Christianity will vanquish all of humanity ultimately on the Day of Judgment. Islam also has this notion of Day of Judgment. Hinduism doesn't have. So in Hinduism, there is no question of conquest of or vanquishing of other falsehoods, etc., or other religions. But Christianity and Islam have that. So both Christianity and Islam are thus meant to be world religions. They will encompass the whole world before the world's end, before the Day of Judgment. So therefore, as Islam came to the world in the 7th century, it began to write history of itself. First history of Prophet Muhammad and others, Prophet Muhammad's companions, and so on and so forth, and their struggles and wars and battles and so on and so forth, and everything else that went with it. So that Islam gave a new religion to the world, as Tarif Khalidi has put it, as well as a new concept of history, a concept of history which was to grow slowly from the history of the Prophet and companions and so on and so forth. It began to encompass history of society and history of battles and wars and society and so on and so forth. It began to expand its scope and grow. There is one particular while Herodotus was writing by the way, Herodotus wrote histories, not history. His book is titled Histories, not History. Not singular, but plural. Why? Because he says in the book, what I'm writing of is tales and traditions. Tales and traditions. So the kind of history that we know, a story, any event that you describe, any phenomenon of history that you describe, you have to prove that this was so. There has to be a proof for this. You have to scrutinize whether it is true or false. And for scrutiny, you need evidence to prove one way or the other. History is much like a court of law. You have to prove your point through evidence. So that when Herodotus was writing history or early Christianity, or even before Christianity, of course, early era of early decades of Christianity, when history was being written, there was no question of scrutiny of what you're describing. There was no question of proving the authenticity of, authenticating what you're narrating, proving evidence, providing evidence for what you're narrating. Nobody even questioned, is it true or is it not true? Questioning was not part of the discipline of history in Herodotus' time or in the time of early centuries of Christianity. Interestingly, in the Islam, there is a notion of authenticating your evidence. How do you authenticate your evidence? There are many ways of doing it. Evidence is one. But there is a very strict adherence to chronology in Islamic history, in the history or in history in the Islamic world. Very strict adherence to chronology. This event took place on this day of this week, this month, of this year. You describe that event in that particular year or that month or day or week or day or whatever. And then you say, and another event which took place on this in this year or in this month was this. Then you describe another event which took place in that year or that month or whatever. So they ascribe a particular day, particular chronology, very strict chronology. They place these events that they are narrating in history. That's what they do all the time, narrate events. When the history in history that the events that they're narrating are placed in a very strict chronological order, very strict chronological. It can't be broken. There are many ways of sticking to this strict chronology. One, of course, is you say, in this year, this event took place, etc. Another method is, I don't know if you're familiar with the term abjad, A-B-J-A-D, abjad. In Arabic term, abjad means, which is peculiar to Islamic system of history writing. Abjad is, the letters of Arabic letters of Arabic script, alif, be, pe, etc., each has a numerical value. Alif, which is equivalent to A, has 1, is equivalent to 1. Be, next, B, which is equivalent to 2, and like it goes on. And the last letter has 900, equivalent of 900. So each letter has a numerical value. So what you do is, you form some kind of a phrase or some kind of a verse or anything, one phrase or anything. The letters of which will convey to you the date of that event. You describe an event, narrate an event, and then you say it happened in this year. Then you further reinforce it by saying, and the abjad for this event is this. So there is a phrase that you concoct, that you compose yourself. You compose, but the composition is such that the numerical value of the letters of this phrase should indicate the date of the event that you are narrating. Like Babri Masjid, there was an inscription on the wall which Mir Baqi, Buwad Khair Baqi. That was his phrase, Buwad Khair Baqi. Buwad Khair Baqi, if you add up the numerical value of Buwad Khair Baqi, all these letters, it will give you the exact date of equivalent of 1528 AD. So that, there is a double sort of reinforcement of the chronological sequence of every event in the Arabic Islamic history, I think. What is the significance of this? In a way, it's a way of authenticating that the event actually did take place. When you just say, like Herodotus would write, this event took place, etc., just like that. But when you say, and there is no proof that it did, when you say this event took place on this date and this month and this year, etc., here is the abjad for that. This is an authenticating that partly, not entirely, but partly, largely in fact, authenticating the actual occurrence of that event. So there is some notion of authenticating events in the Islamic historical tradition, which was not there in European tradition. It wasn't there in Indian tradition, ancient Indian tradition either. So China also has a strong authentication of chronological system. So that several societies have different ways of authenticate, either authenticating or not authenticating, not bothering about authenticating the narration of their events. So there is a diversity of practice here among the different traditions, different social and civilization traditions. Now, I said that in the early European tradition, there is no authenticating of events. You just mention them and leave it at that. Don't have to prove them. But having said that, it's also true that and that there is no explanation of these events. There is no scrutiny, there is no evidence, there is no explanation of these events. They are just mentioned as having happened. But whatever explanations are there, they are rational explanations. They are not providential explanations. God had willed it so, or providence had willed it so, so it happened. There is no such thing as extra historical explanation. All history, all such is first. There are very few explanations anyway, but such as they are rational explanations. They are not. They are not religious explanations or divine explanations or providential, etc. So that's one tradition of rationality, that Greek rationality that was picked up by Renaissance later on in Europe, and highly valued tradition of rationality. This tradition, although what they were narrating was just tales and traditions, but the explanation that was still given was a rational explanation in early Christian era, pre-Christian and early Christian era. However, things changed radically once medieval Christianity intervened. The intervention, particularly at the hands of Saint Augustine, the city of God, that intervention changed the whole landscape of history writing until then, European history writing, that is. The history so far had been described as a collection of events, narration of events. They were happening, so describe them as they happened. Sometimes you explain so and so was actually the son of so and so or not. Okay, yes, he was actually. No, he probably was not. That kind of, But they were each event was almost separate event. They were not interconnected to each other. What Christianity medieval, what Saint Augustine did in his City of God was he gave two attributes to establish two attributes of history. One, that history is one primarily that all history is a manifestation of divine will, right? All history, all historical events that we study have happened because God had willed them to so. God had willed them to happen. So God's will was the explanation that he gave. It was not explanation for one single event or another event or a third event, etc. It was a total explanation for the entirety of history. So everything that's happening in history is happening because of God's will. So God's will gave a large framework of explanation to history, unlike the earlier individual explanations at best. Now this is a total history being explained, because how how is it, how does it become total history? It becomes so because if all events that are happening in the world that we witness or we study are happening because of God's will, then in God's will, the whole past, God knows what has happened in the past, God knows what's happening today, God knows what's going to happen tomorrow. God alone knows. We don't know, but God knows what's. So in God's will or God's mind, everything is part of a huge pattern. Nothing is haphazard. Everything is happened because God has willed it so. Nothing has happened haphazardly on its own. So that God's will gave a pattern to history, a singularity to history, a universal history. Of course, became universal history. God's will doesn't operate in one corner and not in another corner of the earth. It operates everywhere. So all history becomes universal history, and all history becomes part of a whole, single whole, no longer separate events and independent of each other, etc. They are part of one single whole because in God's design, they are part of that single whole, past, present, and future. And therefore, he changed the whole landscape of history uh, by by attributing to it these two phenomena, namely God's will and totality of history. Now, yet there is no scrutiny of the authenticity of events. You narrate the events as they occur or as you come to know. You narrate them, but you don't scrutinize them. You don't ask, is it true that this event took place? How do we know that it took place? Well, God had willed it, so it had happened. And you don't scrutinize something when very respectable, the medieval European historians were all church fathers, padres, because that was the clergy was the only literate class in Europe. The ruling classes, the dynasties were the founders were usually illiterate. For second generation, third generation onward, they began literate. But the founders, the founding fathers of the ruling dynasties were used. They were not literate class. The only literate class was the church fathers. Now, therefore, since they were the only literate class, they are the only ones who wrote history. And if they are the only ones who wrote history, they necessarily wrote it from the point of view that the church has inculcated in them. And that one point that the church had inculcated in their minds was that all that happens is because of God's will. Human will has nothing to do with it. So that history therefore becomes history therefore is not open to scrutiny. This is happening because God has willed it so. It's happening. So you don't question when a respectable church father says it's happening. You don't ask questions, and therefore you accept whatever has happened as the truth. Uh, in the 17th century, later than Saint Augustine, considerably later than Saint Augustine, another very major development in the discipline of history, in the evolution of the discipline of history took place, something with which we are still living today. In a way, I started with that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The discipline, the development was the notion of periodization in history began to evolve. It began to evolve from about the 16th century onward. and was finalized in 1688, towards the end of the 17th century. This tripartite periodization, ancient, medieval, and modern, this was finalized in 1688. Actually, it was finalized it evolved in the history of theology, in the history of church and theology, but gradually it spread to the society. And therefore, society's history began to be divided into ancient history, medieval history, modernity, something that we live with in the 21st century as well. Probably will also live in the 24th century. Anyway, so the notion of periodization occurs now, 16th, 17th century, which changes the notion of history altogether. It's no longer, why does it change? It's no longer beyond scrutiny, it's subject to scrutiny. Why is it subject to scrutiny? Because you began to ask questions. This event took place. When did it take place? How do we know when did it take place? It took place then and not later or not earlier. So you begin to ask questions. Questioning is the point of new developments that were taking place and departing from divine will. Divine will did not allow any questioning. Now you begin to ask questions, and therefore history as a discipline began to acquire the attributes with which we are began to acquire attributes with which we are so familiar today. We have become familiar over the last 4 or 5 centuries. Now, the periodization and this questioning was also broken down to something again we are familiar with. Primary sources. First, let me say, it's broken down to sources. When you question something, you ask, what is the source? What is the source of your statement that this happened then? What is the source? And source then began to be questioned again, and it began to be broken down into two kinds of sources, something that we are so familiar with, primary sources and secondary sources. This again happened in around the 16th and 17th, particularly in the 17th century. Two kinds of sources, primary sources and secondary sources. Don't we use these primary sources and secondary sources in our everyday study of history? Every book has different sections at the end, bibliography, primary sources and secondary sources. What are the primary sources? This happened in the 17th century. What are the primary sources? Primary sources are those which are close to the event that they're narrating. And secondary sources are those which are distant from that event and which have secondary sources are those which have been written on the basis of primary sources. Let me any example that you all must have read Irfan Habib's any book that you mentioned. Irfan Habib's agrarian system of Mughal India, right? Now, he uses primary sources for describing the agrarian system of medieval India, of Mughal India. What are the primary sources? All the court chronicles which had been written in the Mughal court. These were written along as the events were taking place. They were recording the events. They are like Akbarnama and Aine Akbari, and so on and so forth, Jahangir-nama, and so on and so forth. So all of these are primary sources because they are not necessarily in they could be in any language. They could be They could be written by anyone in any language, but they should be close to the event that they are narrating, so that there is a kind of almost an eyewitness account of events, either an eyewitness account or an account of a close witness to the event, who has heard it from very close quarters, who have got to know it from very close, very reliable, close sources, who have been witness to these events, and so on and so forth. So that primary sources and secondary sources, which is a very Irfan Habib has used all these Akbarnama and Akbari, etc., etc. But his book Agrarian System is not a primary sources. It's a secondary sources. It's a secondary sources of Mughal history. It's a secondary source of Mughal history. It's not primary source. This distinction that I'm making, it's a very simple distinction, was made as around the 17th century, late 16th, 17th century, this distinction. And therefore it established a very firm foundation of what is known as empiricism. Empiricism is what is the data for your statement? What is the evidence of your statement? What is the evidence for making this statement? What is the empirical evidence of your statement? So the historical narrative began to be judged not as a manifestation of God's will and without questioning, without scrutiny. It began to be judged on the basis of sources that you have used, what kind of evidence that you have produced, whether the evidence is primary evidence or secondary evidence. If it has used its primary evidence, primary sources, then it is more reliable. If it has used only secondary sources, it is less reliable, but it is still a book of history. So that this the empiricism that began to evolve in the 17th, 16th, 17th century onwards, this began to change the very landscape of history writing. The real break came in the 19th century, in the first quarter of the 19th century, with a German historian called Leopold Ranke. Ranke made a very he he very profound statement, a statement which has lasted till now, a statement which is just 5 words in German and 7 words in English. It's not even a book or a chapter in a book. It's not even a chapter actually written in the introduction to his book in 1824. He writes almost casually, he writes, but it becomes a fundamental premise of history writing since then. Namely, he says, history tells us, what is history? History tells us as it really happened. History tells us as it really happened. 7 words in English, 5 in German. I don't know German, so I can't say. But anyway, history tells us as it really happened. The emphasis here is on really happened. The reality of the narration of history. That how do we know that it really happened? What is the authenticity of these? How do we make sure that what we are narrating is really happened? For that, his formula was, you go on collecting facts of history, empirical facts of history. Just go on collecting. All historians should merely be collecting facts of history, empirical facts of history. And one day will come, don't ask any questions. Don't reach any generalizations, any lessons from what you have collected. Don't interpret them. Just collect them. Put them there. Collect them. And one day, all the facts of history will have been collected. And that is the day when history will tell us as it really happened. The empirical basis of the truth of history or the veracity of history, truth or untruth, one doesn't know, maybe truth. It is the veracity of history. The veracity of history will have been established when all the facts will have been collected, all the facts of history. So one day, all of these facts will have been collected. So go on collecting. This is the height of empiricism, the ultimate in empiricism. Don't interpret them, don't generalize, just go on collecting facts. This is the height of, and history will tell you as it really happened. And Lord Acton, another great champion of empiricism towards the end of the 19th century, this was in the first quarter of the 19th century, that was towards the end of the 19th century, he said, all the facts have almost been corrected. Give another 10 or 20 or 30 years, then all the facts will have been collected. Then history will tell us as it really is. History tells us it will tell us as it really happened, just as physics tells us as physics operates, or just as any science tells you. All of these notions have descended from the positivist notion of science. Science is science. Science, the science, the data of science are given to you. The data of science cannot be changed. The distance from Earth and Moon is given to you. The shape of the Earth is given to you. It can't be changed. The distance from Earth to Moon or Moon to Mars is given to you. It can't be changed by human intervention. So that solid base database, which is unchangeable, unimpactable, human beings can't impact that. That solid, unchangeable, immutable database of science gives you exactly or almost exact results, almost exact 100, almost 100%. There are also variations, but almost 100% results, or 100% verifiable results, which cannot be after a point, after they have been proven, they can't be challenged. So that in the same thing, the assumption was that the same thing is true of social sciences as well. Economics is a science, political science is a science, history is historical science. Same thing is happening in science, in social sciences. So sociology, the founder of sociology, Auguste Comte, thought that sociology is the most reliable of all disciplines, much more than mathematics is. Mathematics is totally unreliable because mathematics, according to him, has no objective basis that 2 plus 2 make 4 is what we assume it makes them make 4. But there is no objective basis that 2 and 2 will make 4. But in sociology, according to him, there is an objective basis of the what you predict about social behavior and so on. So this dream of bringing natural sciences, the methodology of natural sciences to social sciences in the late 19th and early 20th, in the 19th and beginning of 20th century, particularly in the 19th century, this what changed the discipline of history altogether. And the kind of history that we are studying is exactly given to us by 19th century empiricism. History tells us we are all looking forward to, we're looking at our portion of history as if it is telling us as it really happened. To us, to each historian, his or her history tells him or her as it really happened. The reality of it is you test and prove and check and scrutinize and prove and produce evidence and produce argument and so on and so forth to prove that this really happened. So the proving the reality of history, just like a science, like in the sciences, that is what they became universalized in the 19th and early 20th century, they were accepted throughout the history. Throughout. So, as a result of the universalization, of course, took place because of the power relations between Europe and the rest of the world. It was a European power of political power, economic power, colonial power, and power of intellectual power that this became universal. This periodization became universalized, and empiricism became universalized, and the notion that history tells us as it really happened became universalized. So what happened in the 19th century was what Jack Goody calls the theft of history. History was stolen. Whose history was stolen? The early kinds of history that I was talking of, Chinese history, Chinese notion of history, early Indian notion of history, Islamic notion of history, all the different kinds of notions that were prevalent, they were all wiped out by this empiricism and periodization. They were all wiped out, and one single notion of time, Christian era, BC and AD, now BCE and CE, but that was imposed. One single notion of space, namely territory, no other notion of space except territory. There were several other notions of territory prior to that. Now there was only one notion of space, namely territory. There is cultural space, there is moral space, there is social space. Territory is one kind of space. But all of these were wiped out, and one notion of history, theft of history, as Jack Goody calls it, one universal notion was superimposed on all other notions of history. Now, let me deal with quickly, I'm coming towards the end. The periodization that I talked of looks very simple, very easy, honest. There is the ancient period, and we progress from ancient to medieval to modern period. That's how history progresses. One, there is a certain violence inherent in this notion of periodization. The violence is when you divide when they divided history into, Europe divided its own history into three parts: ancient and medieval and modern. Logically you proceed from ancient to medieval to modern. That's how the progression happens, doesn't it? But here it was the other way around. You proceed from the modern to the medieval and ancient. When the three-part periodization was devised in the 17th century, first they defined what is modern. They had a self-image of modernity. 17th century Europe was fairly becoming modern. So how was it becoming modern? It was becoming modern by becoming the opposite of what it was in the medieval period. So they attributed they assigned certain attributes to the modern. Modern is rational, modern is scientific, modern is progressive, modern is technologically advanced. Medieval, therefore, is what is not modern. Medieval is not what it is. Medieval is what it is not. It is not modern. It is not rational. It is irrational. Medieval is not scientific. It is backward. It's not progressive. It is backward. It is static. It's not dynamic, and so on and so forth. So they inflicted a violence on their own medieval period, medieval history, by implicit in this was just as implicit in the notion of notion of single truth I talked of earlier in the context of Christianity and Islam. The notion, it was implicit that ultimately that truth will win, will vanquish the untruth. Here also the notion was implicit, inherent in it, that the rationality will vanquish irrationality. Science will vanquish backwardness. Progress will vanquish regressiveness, etc., etc. And reason will vanquish religion and religiosity, which is all superstitious. So that there is a violence inherent in this periodization, and which violence becomes even more doubly uh, threatening when it comes to India. To India, this ancient, medieval, modern was universalized, as I said. Every society began to talk in terms of its own ancient, medieval, and modern. India also did. The first time India used the term ancient, medieval, modern was in 1903, as late as 1903. Uh, uh, but it came to India not as ancient, medieval, and modern. It came to India further with another kind of distortion. Namely, it came to India as not ancient, medieval, and modern, but Hindu, Muslim, and British period. So that medieval, which was subject to violence in Europe, here became the Muslim period became the subject to violence. So that the James Mill's Muslim period became the subject to violence. And therefore, the justification in it, the justification inherent in it of colonialism will rid or will rid India of its oppressive uh, medieval Islamic, what was medieval in Europe, medieval repression, regression, backwardness in Europe became a Muslim backwardness, Muslim repression, Muslim regression here, etc., rather than a medieval at least is a non-religious term. Here it became a religious term, and therefore the history of a society began to be seen in terms of the history of communities or religious terms rather than in terms of rather than in terms of societies as it was done in Europe. So that this was the colonization of history here, of colonization of history in India. Namely that where earlier, it's not as if Islam was not known earlier. Islam obviously it was, yeah. But earlier in medieval India, which I've studied in particular detail, in medieval India, the explanation of historical events, was not done in terms of God's will, Allah's will, but in terms of ruler's will. If the ruler was strong, then he conquered lots of territories. If he was weak, he lost territories. If the ruler was like Alauddin Khilji, he went and conquered a lot of Deccan. So it was the ruler's nature or his will or his nature which manifested itself in the events during his reign. So for Saint Augustine, the world's events are a manifestation of God's will. For medieval Indian historians, there are plenty of them, tens of them. For them, the events of a reign, of a ruler's reign, are the manifestation of the ruler's will or ruler's nature. So, if Akbar is a very liberal ruler, he will be a very liberal ruler. If Akbar is of a very liberal nature, he will follow very liberal policies. If Aurangzeb is of a dogmatic nature, he will follow very dogmatic policies and so on. So it became entirely a very individual human will, human nature kind of explanation. Now, if that was the case, then since human nature differed, one human being's nature differed from another human being's, one ruler's nature differed from another ruler's nature, therefore their explanation of their events also differed from one ruler to another. As I just told you, the explanation of Alauddin Khilji's events of his reign in terms of his strong will as a strong ruler, of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, weak ruler. He lost so many territories because he was a weak ruler. Akbar, he was a very liberal ruler, so he followed liberal policy. So in terms of human, so whole range of explanations in terms of range of human will and human nature. But what James Mill did was he displaced all of it and imposed on it uh, all these diverse explanations, just one single explanation, namely religion of the ruler. A Hindu period, Hinduism was an explanation of all that was happening. Muslim period, his Muslim period, uh, Islam explains everything. And of course, he was very dead opposed to all religions, including Hinduism and Islam, but he was particularly harsh on Islam. And he was the one who was the first to give this concept of two nations constantly in conflict with each other. He calls Hindus and Muslims in India in his time, 1818, two nations, two nations, uh, uh, two nations constantly. So it's not Savarkar's or Jinnah's invention. It was James Mill's invention, this two-nation theory, which led to the partition of India. So this is what colonization is. Namely, you dispense with all the other kinds of explanations, all the other traditions of history writing, historical explanation, collection of historical data, scrutinizing of historical data, methods, various kinds of concepts of time, space, society, civilization, etc. You displace all of them and substitute for it one single explanation, namely religion of the ruler. Religion is the only explanation. So for the next nearly 200 years, no, not more than, in fact, more than 200 years, uh, almost 200 years, we practiced this kind of history, colonial history, which was premised upon, which was predicated upon one single explanatory framework, namely the religion of the ruler. Not even the religion of the people or community, but religion of the ruler. So religion is the only explanation of history that was the fundamental colonization of history in India. After independence, I am in a way lucky to have lived through, the colonial kind of history that was taught as a student. Then we began to realize that, how history was beginning to change. Many things happened of decolonization. Many things happened. One was that history began to expand. When you are talking of Hindu period, Muslim period, British period, you are talking only of rulers, Hindu rulers, Muslim rulers, British rulers. That's all. History consists of the rule of these rulers. After independence, history began to expand enormously in various different directions, fascinating different directions. History of society, history of economy, history of technology, history of migrations of people, history of ecology, history of women, history of sexuality, history of rains and forests, and deserts, history of concepts, and so on and so forth. It can go on. History of small religious sects, history of regions. History of India is not one history. History of India is many histories put together. Each region has its own history. So that all of this great expansion that began to take place after independence, as I said, I happened to be beneficiary of this as a student, both of the colonial kind of history and the post-colonial kind of history that began to develop after independence in the 1950s, 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and so on, developing, still developing. So that decolonization was one expansion, great expansion of subjects of history, themes of history, and B, giving up of one single locale of historical explanation, religion. Religion, yes, one important aspect of history, yes, but not the only thing that explains history. There are many things which explain history, many things that explain history. Each, each event is explained by not one single causation, but by a conjuncture of causation. Many factors join in when a big event takes place. Not just one factor, one little factor. Uh, so that, and certainly not the personal nature of the ruler and so on and so forth. So that this great expansion that took place fundamentally changed the very nature of history writing in the post. And one expansion took place was in the late 1950s and 60s and 70s was Marxism came in with a big bang, virtually. Three or four major historians, D.D. Koshambi, Irfan Habib, R.S. Sharma, they major historians, they intervened and changed the very framework of studying history writing. Instead of earlier, James Mill had given us the community identity as the entry point into history, religion as the entry point into study of history. You study history through religion as the entry point. Marxism gave a different entry point into history altogether, namely class as the entry point rather than religious community. So it's a different paradigm shift took place with the coming of Marxism in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. The whole way of looking at history changed, the whole subject of history changed, the whole scope of history changed. But this lasted till about 70s. From 80s onward, Marxism itself had begun to face crisis, both in terms of its theory, its theoretical weaknesses, particularly its weaknesses in explaining. It explained economic aspects of history very beautifully, wonderfully. But it has virtually no explanation for social aspects of history, cultural aspects of history, cultural phenomena of history. How what explanation do you give in terms of class? In terms of class, explanation of the changing concepts of time, for example, through history, changing concepts of space, for example, through history, changing concept of religion itself through history. What class explanation can you give? So that class began to appear as was wonderful in explaining some phenomena, but was inadequate in explaining other phenomena, other questions that were being raised in history writing by new historians. So it was inadequate. And from the 1980s, particularly 1990s onwards, and then the 21st century, the kind of research that is being done by the current generation of historians is absolutely It's a world apart altogether. It's a different world altogether. It's a unheard of, unthinkable themes that they are picking up from various kinds of disciplines. It's becoming uh, becoming multidisciplinary by its own nature. The very theme that you pick up is a multidiscipline. Any theme, migrations, for example, or ecology, for example, or, or anything, concept, history of gender history, for example. So anything, history of the habitat, uh, history of the, you know, history of water, for example. How water has changed lives, and what is the history of water changing lives in whole society. So now, so a decolonization took place, fundamental decolonization took place in the post independence era. Today, uh, today, a kind of decolonization is taking place at the hands of the regime. All that I have described in the last 1 hour or so has happened at the hands of historians themselves. The discipline itself, the discipline of history itself has evolved through its own internal dynamism. Every discipline evolves. Its own internal dynamism has led history to evolve and change. But what is happening today is the regime, the government is sitting and deciding what history should be studied, what history should consist of, what aspects of history should be studied, what events of history should be studied. But, luckily, in a way, the discipline of history has gone far beyond these kinds of, it's not controllable. Many states try to control the discipline of history, not only in India and not only today, but it has happened and is still happening around the world in many parts of the world. But they are not able to. History evolves beyond their control. It breaks their control and evolves. So history is the kind of history that is being, the research that is being done today is a fabulously, it's uncontrollable. It doesn't fall into this category of Muslims and religion and religious oppression and Muslim and Hindu resistance, and doesn't fall into that category. That no serious historian talks about that kind of these kinds of themes, because we have done those kinds of themes in our past, and we have outgrown them. So that I don't think the government will be able to control. But what the government is intending to do is not to control advanced historical research in the universities and advanced centers of research, but to to communalize history once again, as James Mill had done, to communalize it, to bring religion back at the center of historical exploration. Hindu religion and Muslim religion, Islamic, bring it back at the center, and bring back James Mill's kinds of history back here again. But do it at school level. So that at school level, when the children pass their school with this kind of history, all of them have to study history up to the 10th class, will study this kind of history, and none of them, very few, 0.5% of them will probably enroll for this research later on and outgrow that. But 98%, 99% of children will carry this kind of history with them, this kind of history, this kind of distorted version of history that James Mill had given us, colonial version. That is what they are. That is what they are reimposing on us. One, as I said, history has strength enough to outgrow these threats from government. Regimes also change. Regime is also in the throes of a change, as we in the last few weeks, it's already in throes of change. So regimes also change, but history is able to, it has the strength to survive these attempts by regimes to control history, and to decide what history will be taught, what history will be studied in India. Well, friends, thank you very much. Sorry, yeah, more than 1 hour. I hope there are questions.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful lecture. I'm sure everybody enjoyed this and gets enriched from this, as I did. Now it's time for question and answer session. You can unmute yourself and ask directly to sir, or you can write the question in the comment box. In that case, I will read it aloud. So, any questions?
Sir, I'm Ayush speaking, sir.
Okay.
I have one question. The concept of meta history, is it a colonial concept or post-colonial concept? Is it, if we see the history through this kind of lens, the post-modernity, or I
Yeah.
can say the Foucault ideas of power, is it
Right.
colonial or our Indian kind of history?
Well, thank you for asking this question. It's a wonderful question. Number one, I had spoken for long, so I wanted to cut it short. But there, let me just add the finishing touches, as it were. The kind of history that I was constantly saying, the kind of history that is being studied both in India and everywhere else today is a different world altogether. I talked of periodization, the oppressive periodization, tripartite periodization. Today, for example, historians are abandoning this periodization altogether and asking, history doesn't begin with this date or this year or this century, Why, or this doesn't, from this century to this century, doesn't change like that. History began much, much earlier. History began even earlier than human history itself. History began with animals, for example. Non-human history is also history. The history of plants, for example. The history of climate, for example. History of climate is a major area that is being developed, which doesn't fall into ancient and medieval and modern. It doesn't fall into India and China, Europe, and wherever. So it cuts across temporal boundaries, it cuts across spatial boundaries, and it becomes universal by its very nature. When you're talking of climate, when you're talking of pre-human history or animal history or non-human history, it's not bound to any time and any space. It becomes a universal history. So that the kinds of big themes that are meta, you mentioned meta history is one. Well, your question whether it is colonial or not. No, it's not. It's not colonial actually. It's post-colonial. Very much post-colonial. Meta history is just about 30, 40 years, for 50, 40, 30, 40 years old concept, 50 years at the most. Foucault's notion of power is a very important intervention in this in the understanding of history. Very important intervention in the sense that I talked at length about empiricism. and the hegemony of empiricism from the 19th century onwards throughout the 20th century and down to today. Still we keep looking for the truth in history. That is the hegemony that I was talking about. Now, the fact is that the history as it actually happened, as it really happened, can never be found. It is an almost an illegitimate goal, partly because much of it has been destroyed, partly because much of it keeps getting destroyed all the time, and partly because where will you find this history as it actually happened? In the archives, archives tell you that's what they said. Ramke and Lord Acton and so on. Go to the archives. Archives tell you only about the history of kings and queens and princes and lords and so on and so forth. What else do they tell you? Very small fragment of history. They don't tell you what actually happened in history. They only tell you what happened in one part of history, in the battlefields or in the court or in the court maneuvers and so on and so forth. History doesn't tell you what actually happened because and in the assumption that to assume that history will tell you as it actually happened by collecting all the data, there is an underlying assumption which has not been stated, namely that one day all data will have been collected, as I mentioned earlier. All data will have been collected, and history will tell you as it actually happened. After that, what happens to history? History comes to an end. History dies after that because there is nothing left to be done. There is nothing left to be found after that. Everything has been found in history. No, history doesn't die, or any discipline doesn't die. History renews itself by self-questioning, questioning the received wisdom you have received earlier, and going forward. All this talk I was giving for so long, going forward from what you have received as wisdom, and question that, question your own received wisdom, question others' received wisdom, and go forward. So Foucault had questioned the hegemony of empiricism, and he said that there is nothing like the truth as such. What is stated as truth, what is projected as truth, is a question of power. Is a question of mobilization of social power. You see, if I in the 1990s, when this Ram Janmabhoomi movement had started, some of JNU historians, we JNU historians, had issued a pamphlet, Political Abuse of History, called Political Abuse of History, where we showed that, where we tried to show that there was no Ram temple demolished by Babur or anybody else, in terms of historical evidence. We tried to mobilize social power of this truth, what we thought was the truth, namely that no temple was demolished. But the BJP and the political forces had mobilized another truth, their truth, namely, yes, there was a temple and it was demolished 500 years ago, and still they are saying we have recovered after 500 years. We have recovered that truth, that ultimate truth of Ram temple, etc., etc. So, between two mobilizations of power, small group of historians' power and large group of political power, which won? The truth didn't win; it's power which won. So this is what Foucault tells us. It is the mobilization of power not the truth which carries society, which overwhelms society at a given point of time. Then that power is challenged by other powers. And therefore other powers challenge it, and other powers come into conflict, and so on and so forth. And sometimes they win. So that power is a very important contribution of Foucault's, power as a substitute for the historical truth. He says there is nothing like the historical truth. A mobilization of a truth is a mobilization of power. And your success means the success of your mobilization of power, not of the power of the truth that you are propounding. So all of these are very, very last 30, 40, 50 years, not even 50 years, they have arisen. And there are very fundamental questions have arisen. Very, very fundamental questions have risen to challenge the very, to change the very discipline of history. Yes. So that let's not dismiss any one of them. Marxism used to be dismissed at one time. Marxism has a power, at least had a power at one time. But it lost its power because other powers challenged it. So that other powers will keep all powers, any power will keep on being challenged by other powers at all the time. Whether it is in society, or it in politics, or it in your family, or in your university, or in your place of work, wherever. One power always challenging other powers, and therefore there is a change. Change comes through this conflict of power at the local level, at the institutional level, at the social level, or whatever level you are operating. So yes, Arnab, it's not colonial or something. It's very much post-colonial. All of these are very fascinating, very novel, very distinctive new themes which are coming up, and they are all very, very recent, not colonial at all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There are also questions from Shubhronil. I'll read it aloud. There are two questions. How can we approach the question of memory or collective memory in serious historical studies, where the difference between them has led some historians to discard the aspects of memory totally from the study of scientific history? And secondly, is there any role of postmodernist approach and post-colonial approach in recolonizing Indian history?
करने
So,
लौड़े
if,
ये देखो
Yeah, okay. Well, the first one, oh God,
ये
what
देखो
is this? Oh God, what is happening? What is this? What is this happening? Oh God,
This is the thing which you have done. You haven't done, sir.
what is this?
This is called
Where has this come from? Oh my God. Oh my God.
Ayush, please remove him.
Please,
Ayush.
can you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I'm
Oh my God.
extremely sorry, sir.
Oh, acha, yes. Uh, so I forgot your question in the whole. Sorry,
So,
there were two questions.
first one was, how can we approach the question of memory or collective
Oh
memory
yes,
in
memory and.
serious?
I started by saying that there are two aspects to the study of history. One is the past, the notion of past and notion of history. Notion of past is precisely the notion of memory. Past precisely deals with memory, and this past remains with all the historical, academic study that you make of history in the universities and so on and so forth, this memory, independently of that, quite often independently of that, it remains intact in society, and therefore it is this memory. Once again, let me go back to Babri Masjid dispute. Is this memory that the political party mobilized? Memory, it was a memory that not 500 years old memory, about 200 years old memory, but it was a memory that was mobilized. And it is that memory is still being resorted to when they say that we have one Ram Mandir after 500 years. So memory is a very, memory is not, need not be counterposed to history as such. Memory versus, it's not memory versus history, because memory itself is a subject of historical study, you see. How did this memory arise in this society, at what time, under what circumstances? Any memory of a particular hero, for example, any memory of a particular event, for example, any memory of a particular act of generosity, for example, or anything. So memory is a very significant part of. In fact, we keep on separating memory, contrasting memory and history. There is a, say, journal memory studies. It's contrasting, but I think contrast wouldn't do. What is all this? How does all this enter here? Contrast to contrast. The memory is part of the study of the past, and we have to study memory as such, as a this. I don't know. I feel very disturbed.
Sir, actually, the matter is whenever someone wants to join, we are at. But once you said in the lecture that the agenda of BJP is there, I think somebody is sharing the link on all the Telegram group. That's
Oh, I
all
see.
the thing.
I see.
Here is the surveillance capitalism and the government comes, sir.
I see. I think
I
you may be
remove
right.
all of them who just lastly join. I'm extremely sorry, sir, because whenever
You are also feeling very bad about it, obviously.
yes, sir, we are very shameful, sir, for this kind of things. Sir.
Anyway,
Just
let me finish it. So memory is part of the study of history, and actually we should. It's good that Sage has this journal of memory. It's we should historians, professional historians, give
अरे
special
भोसड़ी के
attention to
माँ
the.
चोद दूंगा बहन के लोड़े मेरे को रिमूव क्यों किया मदर चोद तेरे को ज्यादा आ रहेगा मैं चुपचाप बैठा था भोसड़ी के
No, I think let's close this. Hello. No, we can't go on with this kind of language. I think
we are very,
Yes,
I'm
sir.
closing it.
we are very sorry, sir. Very
No,
sorry.
let's
We are very
close
sorry
this.
for this, sir.
Okay, let's close this. Sorry, I couldn't answer, but just say that let's study memory as very seriously as a subject of study. Okay, bye. No, I'm sorry, I can't go on.
Yes, sorry, sir.
What is all this happening, sir?